This is Tim Cronin, assistant baseball coach at Seton Hill University with Figured Out Baseball, and we're going to talk to you guys a little bit about pitch design in terms of a two-seam fastball. Two-seam fastballs are different from the four-seam fastball in terms of their movement, ideally, and also the grip that we put on the ball. With a four-seam, obviously, going across these two seams, right here, 1, 2, or these two, and when you throw it, you're going to go through four seams. That's why it's called four seam. With a two seam, most guys generally, and the way we teach it, is just a grip across these two seams on the front of the ball right here. I think thumb position on a two seam fastball is definitely more important. I think a lot of guys at the big league level, a lot of guys that I've seen at the college level, tucking the thumb tends to be easier for them on a two seam fastball. So we mentioned on the four seam that we like to have the thumb kind of up on the ball like this. When we throw a two seam and we shift the ball, I think getting the thumb under the ball allows for a truer release on the two-seam fastball. Now, difference between two-seam fastball and a four-seam fastball is the way the ball moves. Now, with technology and with all this pitch metric stuff, it's allowed us some insight. With technology and with all this pitch metric stuff, it's allowed us some insight that simply changing the grip from a four-seam fastball to a two-seam fastball does not make the pitches any different. What makes the pitches actually different is how we release the ball. So if you throw a four-seam fastball and you release it true 100% backspin, whatever your movement is, how much it moves sideways or up and down, if you simply switch your grip to a two-seam and release the ball the exact same, you won't have any difference in movement. The way we're going to have a difference in movement is anytime we can finish the pitch with our middle finger, index finger, and apply some tilt to the baseball. So if you think of it this way, if someone throws a two-seam fastball across these seams and they generate true backspin like this, that will be the same as their four-seam fastball. Anytime that we can make the baseball turn like this upon release, that's when we're going to see true two-seam movement where the ball is going to be able to run and sink a little bit more. A lot of guys, you hear the term sinker, two-seam fastball. It's generally the same thing, released the same way. But when we release the ball and our middle finger is the last thing to go off it, we're creating a little bit of tilt on the baseball, which makes the ball run and create a difference between our two-seam and our four-seam. If our four-seam fastball and our two-seam fastball move the exact same, then there's really no point in throwing both of them. Having the same pitch with two different grips is pretty counterproductive in my opinion. So I think a lot of times at the high school level, and we see it at the college level, guys who think they throw four-seam fastballs and two-seam fastballs really don't. There's not any difference in how much the ball moves. I would look at your guys and look at kind of their arm slots. If it's a guy that's a low, maybe a sidearm or a low three-quarter guy, and he throws two pitches that you think move relatively similarly, four-seam and two-seam, I would say generally just stick with the two-seam grip. And if you have a guy that comes from a high arm slot and he throws a four-seam and a two-seam that are relatively similar, I would tell him to just stick with the four-seam fastball. So contrary to the four-seam fastball, where we mentioned in the previous video that guys with a true four-seam fastball with a high spin rate, that ball plays pretty effective up in the zone. It's relatively opposite for the two-seam fastball. In terms of velocity, we want it to be a little bit slower than the four-seam, not a ton. And also we would like to take some spin off the baseball to allow a little more downward movement. So if a guy's a low three-quarter, low slot, and they throw a two-seam fastball, it's probably more beneficial for them to pitch down in the zone and really emphasize that getting the ball down in the zone will allow the ball to ride more down the zone, be more effective. You see a lot of guys, you watch big league baseball, you watch any baseball, guys that throw a lot of two-seam fastballs, they get the ball in the middle of the plate, it tends to flatten out and get hit pretty well. So guys who throw a two-seam fastball, always throwing a fastball up in the zone might be effective every now and then, but if you're a guy who throws a true two-seam fastball with two-seam movement, pitching down in the zone would be significantly more effective. In terms of differences in release points between four-seam and two-seam fastballs, for a four-seam, we generally want to stay behind the ball with the best, behind and on top of the ball the best we can, and we want to release with even pressure in this motion right here. And then when we throw a two-seam fastball, I mentioned that we want to have kind of the middle finger be the last thing to touch the ball. We almost want to tilt. We can pre-tilt the axis with our wrists like this. So four-seam, we'd be more straight up. Two-seam, we can tilt it a little bit this way and make sure that the ball is coming off almost sideways. If you tell your athletes to almost feel like they're trying to create side spin with the baseball, that's a good cue that works for people, because that'll make their middle finger be the last thing that comes off the ball. So four-seam fastball we want like this, and then a two-seam fastball we want a little more of a tilted release point like this. Now for the four-seam, the two-seam, we don't want to change arm slots. We don't want to manipulate the four-seam here and have the two-seam come down here. That will create different movement, but that is easily visible to a hitter. So we want the ball to come out of the same arm slot, but we can just manipulate the ball and the way it comes out of the hand, but ideally they should come out of the same arm slot for a pitcher. Now in terms of two-seam fastballs, I think the most common grip is for guys to pretty much just look at the front of the baseball and come right across it. That's not the only grip. Whatever feels comfortable for the athlete. Some people like to tilt the baseball up a little more, and by tilting it up, we get the little wider seam, so it gives guys a wider grip in the ball, which again covers more surface area with the fingers, which tends to give guys a little better feel of the ball. Another grip, if they have good feel for the baseball, is putting their fingers together in the middle and kind of coming off of the two seams. That's also something I've seen that can work. And then also, if you look at the front of the baseball like this, guys can come and put their fingers totally across these seams. That puts seams on the bottom of these two fingers and also with their finger pads on top of this seam. So whatever's comfortable. I would say if you have a guy that's having trouble with command and having a hard time feeling with it, more of their fingers on the seams at all times is beneficial, because they'll really be able to feel the ball and the seams release off their fingers. If you have a guy that has great command and a good feel for it, but maybe it's just not moving the way they want, I think maybe trying the middle where your fingers aren't necessarily on the seam would be beneficial grip for the two-seam as well. This is Tim Cronin from Seton Hill University. That was pitch design with a two-seam fastball. Check out my next video. It's going to be pitch design in regards to a curveball.